Some encounters are meant to heal the deepest wounds in our hearts. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can save two lives at once. In rural Pennsylvania, 1938, an aging Amish farmer named Abram Miller discovers a hungry 10-year-old girl hiding near his barn. She's dirty, stubborn, and clearly has nowhere to go. Instead of turning her away, he offers her a simple deal. "You can clean my farm for a plate of food." What starts as a practical arrangement slowly becomes something neither of them expected. As days turn to weeks, their mutual silence gives way to warmth, then laughter, then something that feels like family. But when outsiders start asking questions about where she came from, Abram faces an impossible choice between following his community's strict rules and following his heart. What happens when two broken souls find each other in the shadow of tradition and judgment? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves across Abram Miller's wheat fields, a reminder that another harvest season had passed in solitude. At 58, his hands bore the calluses of decades spent working the Pennsylvania soil, but his shoulders carried a heavier burden, 5 years of grief that had settled into his bones like winter frost. Sarah's wooden rocking chair sat exactly where she'd left it that final morning, positioned by the parlor window, where she could watch the children play in the yard while mending their clothes. The chair hadn't moved since the fever took them all. Abram couldn't bring himself to sit in it, couldn't bear to move it, couldn't even dust it properly. It had become a shrine to everything he'd lost, a constant reminder of laughter that once filled these rooms. His daily routine had become a careful dance around memories. Rise before dawn, tend the animals, work the fields until exhaustion made thinking impossible, then collapse into his bed without looking at the family portraits lining the hallway. The neighboring Amish families, Bishop Eli Stoltzfus and his wife Ruth, the Baylor family with their 7 children, old Jonas Yoder with his gentle wisdom, they'd tried to pull him back into community life. They brought casseroles and invitations, offered help with harvest and gentle suggestions about remarriage. But Abram had built walls around his heart as sturdy as the stone fences bordering his property. The farm itself reflected his isolation. Once Sarah had maintained flower gardens that burst with color each spring, marigolds and sunflowers, neat rows of vegetables, herbs hanging to dry in the kitchen. Now only the essential crops remained. The farmhouse, once painted a cheerful white with green shutters, had faded to weathered gray. The vegetable garden had surrendered to weeds years ago. On this particular evening, as October painted the maples in shades of fire, Abram secured the barn against an approaching storm. The weathered structure creaked in the wind, and he made mental notes of repairs that could wait another season. Everything could wait another season. He'd learned to live with just enough food, enough warmth, enough work to keep moving forward. That's when he heard it, a soft, scraping sound from behind the grain storage. His first thought was raccoons again, or perhaps a stray cat seeking shelter. But when he rounded the corner with his lantern held high, he found something that stopped his heart. A child, a girl, no more than 10 years old, crouched against the barn wall like a cornered animal. Her dark hair hung in tangles around a dirt-streaked face, and her clothes, a threadbare dress and worn boots several sizes too large, spoke of hard traveling. In her small hands she clutched a broken broom handle and an empty tin pail, holding them like weapons or treasures. He couldn't tell which. Their eyes met in the lantern light, and Abram saw something that nearly brought him to his knees. Fear, yes, but underneath it, a desperate dignity that reminded him of Sarah when they'd first met, stubborn and proud despite circumstances that would have broken weaker spirits. "Please, mister," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady as bedrock. "I can work. I can clean and cook and tend animals. I just need—" She swallowed hard, and he could see the cost of asking for help. "I just need something to eat." Abram stood frozen, lantern trembling in his grip. 5 years of careful isolation, of avoiding exactly this kind of complication, of keeping his world small and manageable. But looking at this child, he saw himself, lost, hungry, desperate for something he couldn't name. "When did you last eat?" he asked gently. "Yesterday morning, maybe the morning before." She lifted her chin defiantly. "But I'm not begging. I'm offering to work for it." The storm chose that moment to announce itself with a rumble of thunder that shook the barn timbers. Rain began pattering against the roof, and the girl flinched but held her ground. Abram made a decision that would change both their lives. "You can clean my farm for a plate of food," he said simply. "But first, you come inside before this storm soaks you through." The girl's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. She followed him across the muddy yard, to the farmhouse, keeping several careful steps behind, ready to bolt if this kindness proved false. In the kitchen that had seen too little use these past years, Abram lit the wood stove and pulled ingredients from shelves that Sarah had organized with loving care. Bread, butter, preserves she'd canned before the fever came, cold chicken from yesterday's meal, milk still fresh from his morning chores. The girl sat at the wooden table, the same table where his own children had eaten countless meals, and watched his every movement with alert caution. When he set the food before her, she whispered a brief grace in a voice too mature for her small frame, then ate with careful control despite her obvious hunger. She didn't wolf the food down like a desperate animal. She ate like someone who remembered better times, who understood manners and dignity even in desperate circumstances. "What's your name?" Abram asked, settling into the chair across from her. She hesitated, as if even her name was something precious to be guarded. I go by Mouse." "Mouse isn't a proper name for a young lady. It's the name I use now." Her tone carried a finality that suggested the subject was closed. They sat in silence, broken only by the storm rattling the windows and the soft sounds of her careful eating. Abram found himself studying her face in the lamplight, the high cheekbones that spoke of good breeding, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she held her fork like someone who'd been taught proper table manners. "Where did you come from?" he asked eventually. "East," she said, which told him nothing and everything. East meant cities, meant complications, meant a world beyond their peaceful farming community. Family? Her jaw tightened. None that matter. When she finished eating, she stood and began clearing the table without being asked. Abram watched as she washed the dishes with practiced efficiency, dried them carefully, and returned them to their proper places as if she'd lived in this kitchen all her life. "The barn has a loft," he said finally. "Clean straw, warm enough if you don't mind the company of a few barn cats. I've slept in worse places." She paused at the sink, her small hands gripping the edge. "The work, what kind of cleaning do you need?" Abram looked around the kitchen with fresh eyes, seeing it as she might. Floors that hadn't been properly scrubbed in months, windows clouded with dust, surfaces that bore the patina of a man living alone without care for appearances. "Start with whatever needs it most," he said. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." That night, as rain drummed against the farmhouse roof, Abram lay awake listening to the storm and thinking about the child in his barn. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't alone on his property. The knowledge sat strangely with him, not unwelcome exactly, but unsettling in the way that change always unsettled a man who'd learned to live with emptiness. In the barn loft, Mouse, if that was truly what she wanted to be called, made her bed in the sweet-smelling hay and listened to the rain on the tin roof. She'd learned to sleep light in the months since leaving Philadelphia, to wake at any unexpected sound, to always know where the exits were. But tonight, with a warm meal in her stomach and the gentle sounds of farm animals settling for sleep, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could rest for a while. Neither of them knew that this simple arrangement, work for food, shelter for labor, would grow into something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, belonging, and the courage it takes to love again after loss. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming with possibility. 3 days into their arrangement, Mouse had already transformed the farmhouse kitchen from a bachelor's careless workspace into something approaching the warm heart Sarah had once maintained. She worked with quiet efficiency, scrubbing years of neglect from corners Abram had learned not to see, organizing shelves with the same careful attention she'd shown while eating that first meal. Abram tried to maintain his usual routines, but found himself stealing glances at the small figure, moving purposefully through his home. She hummed while she worked, not cheerful songs, but something low and melancholy that spoke of old pain, carefully contained. When he asked if she needed anything, she'd shake her head and return to her tasks with renewed focus, as if proving her worth through sheer determination. On the third afternoon, while Abram repaired fence posts in the far pasture, Mouse took on the parlor. She'd avoided the room until now, sensing something sacred in the dust motes that danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through unwashed windows. But the baseboards needed attention, and she was nothing if not thorough. She moved carefully around the rocking chair, Sarah's chair, treating it with the reverence due a church altar. When she lifted the seat cushion to clean beneath it, something crinkled, paper hidden between the cushion and the frame. Her fingers found an envelope, aged and yellowed, and inside it a photograph. The image stopped her cold. A family posed in front of this very farmhouse, but transformed by love and life. A younger Abram, his face free of the lines that grief had carved, stood behind a woman whose smile could have lit the world. Sarah, it had to be Sarah, held a baby in her arms, while 2 older children pressed close to their parents' sides. The boy might have been 8, the girl perhaps 6, both with their mother's bright eyes and their father's strong jaw. Mouse studied the photograph with the intensity of someone trying to memorize faces she'd never meet. This was what happiness looked like. This was what families could be, not sources of fear and pain, but circles of warmth and safety. The ache in her chest surprised her with its sharpness. She was so absorbed in the image that she didn't hear Abram's boots on the porch, didn't notice him standing in the parlor doorway until his sharp intake of breath cut through her reverie. "Where did you find that?" His voice held such pain that Mouse flinched, the photograph trembling in her hands. She looked up to find his face drained of color, his work-hardened features crumpling like paper in flame. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean, it was just there and But Abram wasn't listening. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took the photograph with hands that shook like autumn leaves. For a long moment, he simply stared at the captured moment of joy, his breathing harsh and uneven. "Sarah," he whispered, his thumb tracing his wife's face through the glass. "Oh, my sweet Sarah." The dam that had held for 5 years finally cracked. Tears he'd refused to shed fell freely now, and with them came words he'd buried deep as winter roots. "They were everything," he said, his voice breaking. "Sarah and little Benjamin, Anna and Samuel. Everything good in this world. And I couldn't protect them, couldn't save even one of them." Mouse stood frozen, still holding the cushion, watching this strong man crumble before her eyes. She'd seen grief before, in mirrors, in the faces of other lost souls she'd encountered in her wandering months, but never this raw, this complete. "The fever came in the spring," Abram continued, seemingly unaware that he was speaking aloud. "Started with Benjamin, the baby. Then Anna. Samuel fought longest, my brave boy, but in the end," he choked on the words, "Sarah nursed them all. Wouldn't let me send for the doctor until it was too late. Said the good Lord would provide. Maybe he did, just not the way we hoped." Without conscious thought, Mouse stepped closer. Her small hand found his larger one, weathered and scarred from years of farm work. The touch seemed to anchor him, bring him back from the edge of memory's cliff. "They died in the order they were born," he whispered. "Sarah last, as if she was making sure they weren't alone on the other side." I held her hand at the end. Told her I'd follow soon as I could manage the arrangements. He looked at Mouse with eyes full of wonder and pain. That was 5 years ago. I've been trying to die of loneliness ever since. Mouse understood that. The kind of pain, the weight of loss, the way it could settle in your bones like winter cold that never fully left. But she also understood something else about survival, about the choices that kept you moving when moving felt impossible. Maybe, she said carefully, her voice soft as butterfly wings, maybe you're not supposed to die. Maybe you're supposed to remember them by living. Abram stared at her, this child who'd appeared like an answer to a prayer he'd been afraid to pray. In her dark eyes, he saw not pity but understanding, the recognition of someone who'd also lost everything and found the strength to keep going. "What did you lose?" he asked gently. For a moment, Mouse's careful composure wavered. Her free hand moved unconsciously to her throat, to something hidden beneath her worn dress, and Abram caught a glimpse of a chain, silver, delicate, expensive, everything that mattered, she said finally. Everyone who was supposed to protect me. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, connected by shared sorrow and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd found something worth protecting in each other. The photograph lay forgotten on the chair between them, a bridge between past love and possible future healing. "I don't even know your real name," Abram said. Mouse was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, barely audible, "Rebecca. My name was Rebecca." Is, she corrected, as if testing the sound of truth. "Is Rebecca, but I've been Mouse for so long I almost forgot." Abram nodded, understanding the need to shed old skins when they became too painful to wear. Rebecca's a beautiful name. Biblical, means to bind or to tie firmly. "I know." She met his eyes. "My mother chose it. She said it meant I'd always be connected to the people who loved me, no matter what happened." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A name meaning connection, carried by a child who'd been cut loose from every safe harbor she'd ever known. That evening, they shared their first real meal together at the kitchen table. Not the hurried sustenance of her first night, but a proper dinner with conversation that moved cautiously around the edges of their respective wounds. Rebecca, she'd decided to reclaim the name, at least with him, told him about the cities she'd seen in her travels, the small kindnesses of strangers who'd shared food or shelter without asking questions. Abram shared memories of his family that didn't hurt quite so much in the telling. Sarah's laugh, the way little Anna would sing to her rag doll, Samuel's serious questions about everything from crop rotation to the stars in the sky. As the evening wound down, Rebecca helped clean the dishes, and they fell into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. When she moved toward the door to return to the barn loft, Abram surprised them both by speaking. "There's a small bedroom upstairs, used to be Anna's room." He paused, the words difficult but necessary. "If the barn gets too cold." Rebecca studied his face, seeing the cost of the offer, the way he was choosing to open his closed heart just a crack wider. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'd like that very much." Later that night, as Rebecca settled into a real bed for the first time in months, Anna's bed with its patchwork quilt and simple wooden furniture, she held the photograph Abram had given her before bedtime. Their faces smiled back at her in the lamplight, a family she'd never meet but somehow felt connected to. In his own room down the hall, Abram lay awake, listening to the small sounds of another person in his house. The creak of floorboards, the rustle of quilts, the barely audible whisper of prayers. For the first time in 5 years, the silence didn't feel like a tomb. Neither of them knew that sharing their deepest wounds had created a bond that would soon be tested by forces beyond their peaceful farm. But for now, in this moment of fragile trust, it was enough that they were no longer alone. The wooden spoon had been carved by Abram's father 40 years ago, its surface worn smooth by countless meals, countless hands that had stirred countless pots of stew. It was the kind of kitchen tool that carried more history than function. A connection to family traditions that stretched back generations to the first Amish settlers in Pennsylvania. Rebecca discovered it on her 5th morning in the farmhouse, tucked in the back of the kitchen's deepest drawer beneath rusted can openers and bent serving spoons that had seen better decades. She held it up to the morning light streaming through freshly cleaned windows, admiring the careful craftsmanship, the way the handle fit perfectly in her palm, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. "I'll make us something special for breakfast," she announced to Abram, who sat at the kitchen table mending harness leather before starting his morning chores. The simple domestic scene, him working with his hands while she bustled around the kitchen, felt surprisingly natural after less than a week together. She'd been planning cornbread, the kind her mother used to make before everything went wrong in Philadelphia. The recipe lived in her memory like a precious gem, one of the few purely good things she'd carried from her old life. But memories could be treacherous guides, and the measurements that had seemed so clear in her mind proved elusive in practice. Too much milk, too little flour. The batter, which should have been thick and golden, turned thin and pale as dishwater. Rebecca stirred frantically, trying to correct her mistakes, but the wooden spoon caught in the mixture and twisted in her inexperience grip. The crack seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen, a sharp report like a tree branch snapping in winter wind. Rebecca stared in horror at the 2 pieces of carved wood in her hands, the spoon's smooth bowl separated clean from its handle. 40 years of family history broken by her clumsy enthusiasm. "Oh no," she whispered, then louder, panic rising in her voice. "Oh no, oh no, oh no." Abram looked up from his leatherwork to see her standing frozen at the stove, holding the broken pieces like evidence of some terrible crime. The cornbread batter dripped slowly from the spoon's severed ends, and her face had gone white with distress. For a moment that stretched too long, Abram felt the familiar surge of anger that had become his refuge these past 5 years. Rage. At a world that took away everything precious, that couldn't let him keep even the smallest reminders of better times. The spoon represented not just his father's craftsmanship, but Sunday mornings, when Sarah would use it to stir breakfast while the children dressed for church. Quiet evenings when she'd taste soups with it and adjust seasonings with the kind of intuitive grace that made cooking seem like magic. "That was my father's," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "My father made that spoon with his own hands." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears that she tried desperately to blink away. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I can fix it. I can fix it?" The words came out harsher than he intended. Some things can't be fixed. Some things, once they're broken forever. The pain in her face cut through his anger like a blade through silk. She wasn't just hearing his words about the spoon. She was hearing judgment about herself, about her place in his life, about the worth of a girl who broke precious things and couldn't even make simple cornbread without disaster. "I'll go," she said quietly, setting the broken pieces on the counter with infinite care. "I'll pack my things and go. I don't want to break anything else that matters to you." The words hit Abram like a physical blow, knocking the anger right out of him and leaving only shame in its wake. Here was a child who'd already lost everything, who'd somehow found the courage to trust again, and he'd just proved that trust misplaced with his thoughtless cruelty. "Rebecca, wait." He stood up so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. "I didn't mean—" But she was already moving toward the door, her small frame rigid with hurt and dignified pride. She'd learned long ago that when people showed you who they really were, you believed them the first time. She'd been foolish to think this could be different, foolish to hope that she'd finally found somewhere safe to rest. "Rebecca, please." Abram's voice cracked on her name. "Don't go, please don't go." She stopped at the doorway but didn't turn around. "I break things," she said simply. "I always have. That's why nobody wants to keep me." The naked pain in her voice undid him completely. In 5 words, she'd revealed the heart of her wandering, The reason a 10-year-old child had been surviving alone on the roads between cities. Someone had convinced this bright, brave girl that she was a destroyer of precious things, that her very presence brought ruin to everything good. "That's not true," Abram said gently, crossing the kitchen to stand behind her. "That's not true at all. I broke your father's spoon, and I broke my family." The admission came from the deepest part of him, the place where guilt lived like a cancer. "I couldn't keep them safe from the fever, couldn't save them when it mattered most. If anyone here is a breaker of precious things, it's me." Finally, she turned to face him, tears tracking clean lines through the flour dust on her cheeks. "You didn't mean to. Neither did you." He knelt down until they were eye to eye. "Rebecca, that spoon, it's just wood. Carved wood that can be mended with glue and patience. You know what can't be fixed? A heart that stops caring, a soul that gives up hope. And you've brought both of those things back to life in this house." She studied his face, looking for signs of deception, of the kind of false comfort adults gave children when they wanted them to stop making noise. But all she found was sincerity and something else, regret that ran as deep as her own. "I don't know how to fix it," she whispered. "Neither do I," Abram admitted, "but maybe we could learn together." That afternoon, they sat at the kitchen table, with wood glue and clamps, working to repair what seemed irreparable. Abram showed her how to align the grain, how to apply just enough pressure without crushing the delicate wood, how patience could sometimes accomplish what force could not. "My father taught me to carve when I was about your age," he said, as they waited for the glue to set. "Said every piece of wood had something beautiful inside it, just waiting for the right hands to let it out. What if you have the wrong hands?" Rebecca asked, studying her small palms as if they held secrets she couldn't decode. "Then you learn to make them right through practice, through caring about the outcome more than you fear the mistakes." He covered her hands with his work-roughened ones. "These are good hands, Rebecca. They've cleaned my house with more care than it's seen in years. They've cooked meals that taste like home. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." When the spoon was finally mended, a thin line marked the place where it had broken, but it was whole again, functional, still carrying its 40 years of history, along with a new story of repair and forgiveness. That evening, Rebecca used it to stir a pot of soup that actually turned out right, rich and warm, and seasoned with something that tasted remarkably like hope. The evening Bible reading had become their quiet ritual, a peaceful end to days filled with farm work and the careful dance of two people learning to share space without stepping on each other's wounds. Abram would sit in his chair by the fireplace, while Rebecca curled on the sofa, both of them bathed in the warm glow of lamplight as he read from the worn leather Bible that had belonged to his grandfather. On this particular evening, a week after the spoon incident, Abram had chosen Psalms, something gentle and contemplative to match the mood of October settling into its golden rhythm. He was partway through Psalm 23 when he noticed Rebecca's lips moving silently, not in prayer, but in perfect synchronization with his words. He paused mid-verse. "You know this passage?" Rebecca blushed, as if she'd been caught at something improper. "I know most of them. We read from the Bible every evening when I was, before what?" She hesitated, her fingers worrying at the chain around her neck that she thought he hadn't noticed. "Before everything changed." Abram set the Bible aside and gave her his full attention. In the weeks since she'd arrived, he'd learned to read her silences as carefully as her words. This particular quiet held the weight of things she'd been carrying alone too long. "Would you like to read tonight?" he asked gently. Her eyes lit up with surprise and something deeper, hunger. "You wouldn't mind? I'd be honored." She reached for the Bible with reverent hands, and Abram was struck again by the contradiction she presented. Her clothes were patched and worn, her shoes held together with string and hope, but she handled the sacred text with the familiarity of someone who'd grown up surrounded by books and learning. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she began, and Abram nearly gasped at the transformation in her voice. Gone was the careful, measured tone of a child trying not to draw attention. This was the voice of someone who'd been taught to read aloud with expression and confidence, who understood not just the words, but their music. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. As she continued reading, Abram found himself studying her with new eyes. The careful pronunciation, the natural rhythm of someone comfortable with formal language, the way she automatically corrected the archaic spelling in her head, these weren't skills picked up by a street child or farm girl. This was the education of someone from a very different world. When she finished the psalm, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "Where did you learn to read like that?" The question hung in the air between them like morning mist. Beautiful, but fragile. Rebecca's carefully constructed walls went up so quickly that Abram could almost hear them clanking into place. "Schools," she said vaguely. "Different places. What kind of schools?" She closed the Bible and held it against her chest like armor. "Does it matter? I'm here now, and here is all that counts." But it did matter, and they both knew it. A child with that kind of education, that level of refinement hidden beneath deliberate roughness, didn't just appear on Pennsylvania farms without a story that someone somewhere was trying to finish. "Rebecca," Abram said carefully, "are there people looking for you?" Her face went pale in the lamplight. "Maybe, probably, I don't know. People who care about you, people who own me." The bitterness in her young voice made Abram's chest tight with anger. "There's a difference." Before he could respond, the sound of wagon wheels on the gravel drive interrupted their conversation. Rebecca went rigid, her eyes darting to the window, as if calculating escape routes, and Abram felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. "Expecting visitors?" she whispered. "No." Abram moved to the window and peered through the curtains. In the moonlight, he could make out Bishop Eli Stoltzfus climbing down from his wagon, his wife Ruth beside him. Behind them sat their eldest son Jacob, who served as something of a deputy in community matters that required delicate handling. "It's Bishop Eli," Abram said, and watched Rebecca's shoulders relax slightly. "The community leader I told you about. He's a good man, but he'll ask questions, many questions." Rebecca was already standing, smoothing her dress, preparing for performance. In the space of heartbeats, she'd transformed from the educated girl who'd read psalms with scholarly precision to Mouse, the careful refugee who revealed nothing important about herself. "What should I tell them?" Abram asked. "Whatever you think." "Do best. I'll follow your lead." The trust in her voice nearly broke his heart. Here was a child who'd been failed by adults before, yet she was prepared to put her safety in his hands based on nothing more than his kindness and a week of shared meals. The knock on the door came gentle but firm, the kind of summons that couldn't be ignored. Abram opened the door to find Bishop Eli's weathered face creased with concern and curiosity. Ruth Stoltzfus stood beside her husband with the expression of a woman who'd been listening to community gossip and drawing her own conclusions. "Abram," Bishop Eli said warmly, "forgive the late hour, but we were hoping for a word." "Of course. And please come in." They entered the parlor, and their eyes immediately found Rebecca, who stood near the fireplace with her hands clasped behind her back, the picture of respectful attention. "And this must be the young lady we've been hearing about," Ruth said kindly. "My, aren't you a small thing?" "Ma'am," Rebecca said with a curtsy that was neither too deep nor too shallow, another sign of careful breeding that Abram filed away with growing concern. "We've heard you've been helping Abram with his household," Bishop Eli said, settling into his chair with the deliberate movements of a man who'd learned that important conversations required patience. "That's very kind of you. I'm grateful." "For the work, sir. And where did you come from, child?" Rebecca's pause was so brief that only someone watching closely would have caught it. "Philadelphia, sir, but I've been traveling for some time." Philadelphia is a long way from here. How did you manage such a journey? Abram watched Rebecca navigate the questions with the skill of someone who'd had practice evading adult interrogation. She gave answers that were technically true, but revealed nothing substantial. Yes, she'd traveled mostly on foot. Yes, she'd stayed in various places along the way. No, she didn't have family waiting for her. But Bishop Eli hadn't led their community for 20 years without developing an instinct for unfinished stories. His questions grew more specific, more pointed, until Abram could see Rebecca beginning to wilt under the pressure. "Perhaps," Abram interjected gently, "we could discuss this another time. It's been a long day and Rebecca needs her rest." Bishop Eli studied them both for a long moment, his wise eyes missing nothing. Not Rebecca's carefully controlled fear, not Abram's protective stance, not the way they'd unconsciously positioned themselves as a family unit facing outside scrutiny. "Of course," he said finally, "but Abram, you understand that the community has concerns. A child alone, with no clear history, no family connections we can verify. These things require careful consideration." "I understand." "Good." Bishop Eli stood, and Ruth followed suit. "We'll speak again soon. Rebecca, my dear, I hope you'll feel welcome to join us for Sunday services. The community would benefit from knowing you better." After they left, Abram and Rebecca sat in the lamplight's glow, both of them acutely aware that their peaceful interlude was ending. The outside world had found them, and with it all the complications that Rebecca had been running from. "How long do you think we have?" she asked quietly. "I don't know, but whatever comes, we'll face it together." Rebecca nodded, but Abram could see the fear in her eyes, the knowledge that running was always easier when you had nowhere you wanted to stay. The fever came in the night like a thief, stealing Rebecca's strength and leaving her burning with heat that no amount of cool cloths could touch. Abram woke to the sound of her calling out in delirium, words he couldn't catch mixed with names he didn't recognize. Her small voice rising and falling like a bird caught in a storm. He found her thrashing in Anna's small bed, the patchwork quilt twisted around her legs, her dark hair plastered to her skull with sweat. When he touched her forehead, the heat radiating from her skin sent ice through his veins. Memories of another fever, other small bodies that had burned with the same terrible fire. "No," he whispered, then louder, "No, not again." For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. He saw Sarah's face in Rebecca's flushed features, heard the echo of children's voices calling for help he couldn't give. But then, training older than grief kicked in. The knowledge passed down through generations of farmers who lived too far from doctors to wait for professional help. Cool water, willow bark tea, constant vigilance. He carried Rebecca to his own bedroom, the largest in the house, with windows that could be opened for cross-ventilation. Settling her in the bed where he'd held Sarah during her final hours, he began the patient work of nursing that he'd learned too late to save his own family. Through the long night and into the next day, Abram tended Rebecca with the devotion of a man who'd been given an unexpected chance at redemption. He bathed her burning skin with cool cloths, coaxed sips of willow bark tea between her cracked lips, and spoke to her in the low, gentle voice he'd once used to comfort his own children. "Easy now," he murmured, smoothing her damp hair away from her face. "You're safe here. I'm not going anywhere." In her delirium, Rebecca called out fragments of her hidden past. "Mama, don't let him, and I won't tell, I promise I won't." And once, clearly, "Papa, why did you leave us?" The words painted pictures of a life far more complex than the simple orphan story she'd constructed, and Abram filed them away with growing concern for what she'd been running from. On the second night, as her fever began to break, Rebecca's restless movements disturbed something at her throat. The chain she'd kept hidden slipped free from beneath her nightgown, a delicate silver chain that caught the lamplight like captured starshine. And hanging from it, a locket that made Abram's breath catch in his throat. It was exquisite, real, silver, not plate, with intricate engravings that spoke of craftsmanship money could buy. far too expensive for a street child, far too precious for someone with nothing to call her own. With gentle fingers, he lifted the locket to examine it more closely, and his touch triggered the tiny spring that held it closed. The locket opened to reveal a miniature photograph, a formal family portrait that stopped his heart. A distinguished man in an expensive suit stood behind a beautiful woman in silk and pearls. Between them, unmistakably, despite the formal pose and elaborate dress, was Rebecca. But not the Rebecca he knew. This was a child of privilege, her hair professionally styled, her dress the kind that cost more than most farm families saw in a month. The photograph was recent, no more than a year or two old, which meant somewhere in the world of wealth and status it represented, people were looking for this child. Important people, powerful people, the kind who didn't simply accept the loss of what belonged to them. Abram closed the locket with trembling hands and settled it back against Rebecca's chest. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him like storm clouds gathering. She wasn't just a runaway child. She was someone's daughter, someone's responsibility, someone's legal property in the eyes of a world that rarely listened to what children wanted for themselves. By the third morning, Rebecca's fever had broken completely, leaving her weak but clear-eyed. She woke to find Abram dozing in the chair beside the bed, his head tilted at an angle that would leave his neck stiff for days. The sight of him there, faithful as a guardian angel, brought tears to her eyes. "Abram," she whispered. He jerked, awake instantly, and she could see the moment he focused on her face, checking for signs of returning fever. When he found her truly lucid for the first time in days, relief washed over his features like sunrise. "Thank God," he breathed. "You scared me, child. Scared me more than I care to admit. You stayed with me. Where else would I be?" The simple question held layers of meaning that neither of them quite dared to explore. In caring for her through the fever, Abram had crossed an invisible line from temporary caretaker to something approaching a father. And in accepting that care, in trusting him with her vulnerability, Rebecca had moved from grateful guest to something like a daughter. "I need to tell you something," she said, when she was strong enough to sit up and sip the broth he'd made, "about who I really am." "I know about the locket," Abram said gently. Her hand flew to her throat, and she felt the chain's position, slightly displaced from where she always kept it. Her eyes went wide with something approaching terror. "You looked inside." "I had to. It'd check your temperature. It came loose and—" "Rebecca, who are those people?" She was quiet for so long that he began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets that had nearly crushed her small shoulders. "My father. My real father, not—" She stopped, started again. "He died 2 years ago. Heart attack, they said, but Mama always thought it was the worry, the business troubles, the debts." "And your mother?" "Married again within 6 months. Rebecca's voice went flat and cold. "Richard Ashford. Rich enough to pay off Papa's debts, important enough to give her the social position she'd lost when Papa died. He seemed perfect. Everyone said how lucky we were. But Abram heard what she didn't say in the careful spaces between her words. He wasn't perfect. He was careful at first, always when Mama wasn't around, always things he could explain away if I told. A hand that lingered too long, comments about how I was growing up, little gifts that came with expectations." Her voice grew smaller, younger. "Then Mama got sick last winter. Nothing serious, just confined to bed for a few weeks, but it meant we were alone together more often." Abram's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice gentle. "What happened?" "He said it was time I learned to be grateful for everything he'd given us. Said I owed him for saving us from poverty." She looked up at Abram with eyes too old for her face. "I told Mama when she got better. She said I was imagining things, that I was jealous of her happiness, that I was being spiteful because I missed my real father." The betrayal in her voice cut deeper than any physical wound could have. To lose the protection of the one person who should have believed her, should have stood between her and harm. Abram understood now why she'd run, why she'd chosen the dangers of the road over the supposed safety of home. So you left. I took what I could carry and ran. I've been moving ever since, staying ahead of the people looking for me, trying to find somewhere they'd never think to search. She touched the locket. I kept this because it has my real father's picture. He would have protected me. He would have believed me. Abram reached over and covered her small hand with his work-roughened one. I believe you. The relief in her eyes was so profound, it nearly broke his heart. What happens now? Now that you... No, now you get better. Now we figure out how to keep you safe. He squeezed her hand gently. And now you stop carrying this alone. For the first time since he'd found her in his barn, Rebecca allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone who would choose her safety over convenience, her truth over the comfortable lies adults told themselves about children who asked for help. The autumn wind carried more than fallen leaves that October afternoon. It brought a piece of paper that would change everything. Abram was splitting wood behind the barn when the gust caught the sheet and plastered it against his leg, like a desperate hand seeking attention. He peeled it away, with the casual indifference of a man accustomed to wind-blown debris, but the words printed across the top made his blood turn to ice water. Missing person, 500 reward. Below the headline was a photograph that stopped his heart. Rebecca, but not as he'd come to know her. This was the same formal portrait from her locket, showing a well-dressed child with elaborately styled hair and an expensive dress. The girl in the photograph looked nothing like Mouse, the careful refugee who'd learned to make herself small and unremarkable, but it was unmistakably her. Rebecca Marie Ashford, the poster read, age 10, missing since August 15th from her home in Philadelphia, last seen wearing a blue day dress and black boots, beloved stepdaughter of prominent businessman Richard Ashford, family desperate for her safe return. Contact Philadelphia Police Department or Ashford Enterprises with any information. The words swam before Abram's eyes as the full implications hit him like physical blows. Richard Ashford, the stepfather she'd run from, the man whose unwanted attention had driven her to choose the dangers of the road over the supposed safety of home. He wasn't just looking for her. He was using the full weight of his wealth and position to find her. $500, more money than most farmers saw in 2 good years. Enough to make even honest people consider what they might overlook in exchange for such a windfall. Abram's hands shook as he read the carefully crafted description of Rebecca as a beloved stepdaughter, the implication that her absence was causing a grief-stricken family desperate worry. No mention of why a 10-year-old might choose to disappear into the night. No acknowledgement that children didn't usually run from homes where they felt safe and loved. The poster was professionally printed on expensive paper, not the crude handbills that local sheriffs used for common criminals, but the kind of notice that money and influence could spread far beyond normal jurisdictions. If this one had blown onto his farm, dozens or hundreds more were circulating through Pennsylvania, reaching into every small town and farming community where a strange child might have sought shelter. He was still staring at the poster when Rebecca appeared around the corner of the barn, carrying a basket of eggs from her afternoon chores. She took one look at his face and knew that their careful peace was about to shatter. "What is it?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected. Wordlessly, Abram held out the poster. Rebecca set down her basket with infinite care and took the paper with hands that trembled like aspen leaves. As she read, all color drained from her face, leaving her pale as winter moonlight. $500, she whispered. "He's offering $500 for me." "Rebecca, that's more than most people make in a year." Her voice was hollow, defeated. "That's enough to make anyone turn me in, no matter what I tell them about why I ran." Abram knelt down until he was eye level with her, his hands gentle. On her shoulders, Look at me, child. Look at me and tell me, do you think money could make me betray you? Her dark eyes searched his face, looking for signs of the calculation that had entered the expressions of too many adults when they learned what she might be worth to them. But all she found was the same steady kindness that had offered her work for food, the same protective anger that had flared when she'd spoken of Richard Ashford's treatment. "No," she said finally, "but others. When word spreads that there's a reward when people start talking, then we don't give them reason to talk." But even as he said the words, Abram knew their situation had become infinitely more precarious. The poster changed everything. Rebecca wasn't just a runaway child who'd appeared on his doorstep. She was officially a missing person with powerful people looking for her. Harboring her was no longer simple Christian charity. It was actively defying the law and the authority of her legal guardian. That evening brought confirmation of their worst fears. Bishop Eli arrived alone this time, his expression grave as he settled into his usual chair in the parlor. Rebecca had retreated to her room, but Abram knew she was listening from the top of the stairs. "I trust you've seen the notices that have been posted around the district," Bishop Eli said without preamble. "I've seen them. Then you understand the position this puts us all in. The girl, Rebecca, she's not who we thought she was." "She's exactly who I thought she was," Abram replied carefully. "A child who needed help." Bishop Eli leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. "Abram, I've known you since you were a boy. I baptized you and Sarah, officiated at your wedding, buried your family. I know your heart, and I know it's in the right place. But this situation, harboring a child whose legal guardian is searching for her, this could bring trouble on our entire community. And what would you have me do? Turn her over to a man she's terrified of? I would have you follow the law. Contact the authorities. Let them sort out the truth of the matter through proper channels." Abram stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see the barn loft where Rebecca had first slept. The proper channels failed her before. Eli, her own mother didn't believe her when she asked for protection. What makes you think strangers will do better? Because it's not our place to judge such matters. We are called to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, to respect earthly authority even when we don't understand its workings. The words hung heavy between them, weighted with theological authority and community expectation. Bishop Eli wasn't speaking just as a friend now, but as the spiritual leader of their district, the man whose word carried the force of collective judgment. "The community is divided," Bishop Eli continued gently. "Some support your choice to help the child, but others worry about the consequences of defying civil authority. If you continue on this path, I can't guarantee their continued support." The threat was delivered with kindness, but it was a threat nonetheless. In their tightly knit community, losing the bishop's backing would mean isolation not just for Abram, but for Rebecca as well. No more friendly visits, no offers of help during difficult seasons, no sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. After Bishop Eli left, Abram sat in the lamplight staring at the wanted poster he'd spread on the kitchen table. $500, beloved stepdaughter, family desperate for her safe return. Each word was a carefully crafted lie, designed to ensure Rebecca's capture and return to the man she'd risked everything to escape. He heard her soft footsteps on the stairs, felt her presence before she spoke. "I should go," she said quietly. "Before this causes more trouble for you? Where would you go? Winter's coming on, and now there are posters everywhere with your face on them." "I don't know, but I can't stay if it means destroying your place in the community." Abram looked up at this child who was prepared to sacrifice her own safety to protect his reputation, and felt something solid settle in his chest, a decision that felt like bedrock beneath his feet. "Rebecca," he said firmly, "you're not going anywhere. We'll figure this out, but we'll figure it out together." She studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the resolve there, the quiet determination of a man who'd chosen his side in a battle that was just beginning. "Even if it cost you everything, child," Abram said softly. "I lost everything 5 years ago. Everything that mattered was buried with my family. You're not a cost. You're a gift I didn't dare hope for." Outside, the autumn wind howled around the farmhouse, carrying the promise of harder weather to come. The business card fell from the pocket of Rebecca's old dress like a whisper of damnation. A small rectangle of expensive cardstock that transformed everything Abram thought he understood about her situation. He'd been sorting through her few belongings, preparing to wash the clothes she'd worn during her fever, when the card fluttered to the kitchen floor and landed face up beside his boots. "Ashford Enterprises," it read in elegant script, "Import-Export Specialists, Richard Ashford, President." Below that, an address in Philadelphia's business district and a telephone number that spoke of wealth and influence. But it wasn't the card itself that made Abram's blood run cold. It was what was written on the back in Rebecca's careful childish handwriting. "Meeting warehouse 7 p.m. Tuesday. Tell no one, or they hurt Mama." The words hit him like physical blows. This wasn't just the business card of an abusive stepfather. This was evidence that Rebecca had been involved in something that went far beyond domestic troubles. Something dangerous enough to require secret meetings and threats against her mother. "Rebecca," he called, his voice tight with concern. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, still pale from her recent illness, and immediately spotted the card in his hand. The terror that flooded her face told him everything he needed to know. This was the piece of her story she'd been too frightened to share. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. "In your dress pocket." "Rebecca, what does this mean?" She sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. For a long moment, she stared at the card with the expression of someone watching her worst nightmare take physical form. "I was supposed to throw it away," she said finally. "I meant to throw it away, but I kept it as proof, I suppose. Evidence of what really happened. What really happened where?" Rebecca's hands trembled as she reached for the card, holding it like something that might bite her. "The warehouse meeting. Richard made me go with him that night in July. Said it was time I learned about the family business, that I needed to understand how he'd saved us from poverty." Abram pulled out a chair and sat across from her, keeping his voice gentle despite the urgency clawing at his chest. "What kind of business?" Not the kind in his advertisements. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Not importing legitimate goods from legitimate suppliers. The men at the warehouse, they weren't talking about furniture or textiles or any of the things Richard claims to import." She closed her eyes, and Abram could see her gathering courage to speak truths that had been poisoning her for months. "They were talking about people," she said. "Children, mostly. Moving them from one place to another, selling them to buyers who didn't ask questions about where they came from." The words landed like hammer blows, each syllable more devastating than the last. Human trafficking, child slavery dressed up in the language of business transactions. And Richard Ashford, the respectable businessman whose missing stepdaughter posters were circulating throughout Pennsylvania, was not just abusive but actively involved in crimes that defied comprehension. "Dear God," Abram breathed. "I wasn't supposed to understand what they were talking about. Richard told me to sit quietly in the corner and not listen to adult conversation. But I'm good at listening, and I'm good at understanding things adults think I'm too young to grasp." Rebecca looked up at him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for a 10-year-old. "I heard them planning shipments, discussing prices, arguing about the best routes to avoid law enforcement. And they knew you'd heard." "Not at first. I was careful not to react, not to ask questions that would reveal how much I'd understood. But later at home, I made a mistake." Her voice grew smaller, more frightened. "Richard was hurting Mama, not physically but with words, making her cry about money troubles again. I got angry and told him to stop, that I knew he had plenty of money from his real business. Abram felt ice settle in his stomach. He realized what you meant. He knew immediately. That's when everything changed. Rebecca's hands clenched into small fists. That's when he stopped pretending to be a loving stepfather and started making it clear that I'd become a problem that needed to be managed. The full horror of the situation crashed over Abram like a black wave. Rebecca hadn't just run from an abusive home. She'd fled from a criminal operation where she represented a direct threat to powerful, dangerous people. Her testimony could destroy not just Richard Ashford, but an entire network of human traffickers who had millions of dollars and countless victims to protect. The touching, the inappropriate attention was just the beginning, Rebecca finished quietly. He was testing my boundaries, seeing how much control he had over me. If I'd stayed, if I'd been compliant, she shuddered, I think I would have become part of his inventory eventually. The wanted poster took on sinister new dimensions in Abram's mind. This wasn't a desperate stepfather searching for a beloved child. This was a criminal trying to recapture a witness who could send him to prison for the rest of his life. Or, worse. Rebecca, listen to me very carefully, Abram said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his head. You can never go back to him. Not ever. Do you understand? I know. But Abram, the threats against Mama, if he can't find me, if he thinks I might talk to authorities. Your mother made her choice when she didn't believe you, when she chose his comfort over your safety. The words were harsher than he intended, but Rebecca needed to hear them. You cannot save someone who refuses to be saved, especially not at the cost of your own life. But she's still my mother, and you're still a child who deserves protection. Abram reached across the table and covered her hands with his own. Rebecca, these people, they're not going to stop looking for you. A $500 reward is nothing compared to what your silence is worth to them. I know. That's why I kept running, why I never stayed anywhere long enough to feel safe. She looked up at him with desperate hope. But here, with you, I thought maybe I'd found somewhere they'd never think to look. A simple Amish farm, so far from their world that they'd never imagine. You did find somewhere, Abram said firmly. And I'll be damned if I let them take you. The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. In that moment, Abram felt something shift inside him. The protective instincts of a father awakening after 5 years of dormancy, but with an edge harder than anything he'd felt for his own children. Sarah and the little ones had died of natural causes, beyond anyone's power to prevent. But Rebecca was alive, was here, was his to protect against dangers that wore human faces and could be fought with human determination. What do we do? Rebecca asked. First, we make sure you're safe. Then we figure out how to make sure you stay safe. Abram stood up, his mind already working through possibilities. But Rebecca, this changes everything. I can't just contact the local sheriff. For all we know, Richard Ashford has connections that reach into law enforcement. We need to be very careful about who we trust. No one, Rebecca said immediately. We can't trust anyone. That's the first thing you learn when you're running. Everyone has a price, and everyone will eventually choose their own safety over yours. Not everyone, Abram said gently. I chose differently. And I think there might be others who would make the same choice, if they understood what was really at stake. That night, as Rebecca slept fitfully in Anna's bed, Abram sat by his kitchen window, staring out at the moonlit farmland and trying to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. He'd thought he was sheltering a runaway child. Instead, he'd become the last line of defense between a young witness and a criminal organization that would kill to keep their secrets safe. The wanted posters scattered throughout the county weren't just requests for help finding a missing child. They were recruitment, tools for a manhunt. Every farmer, every shopkeeper, every well-meaning citizen who might spot Rebecca was being turned into an unwitting agent of the very people she'd risked everything to escape. But knowledge, Abram reflected, could be a weapon as well as a burden. If Richard Ashford was as deeply involved in criminal activity as Rebecca suggested, then there were federal authorities who would be very interested in what she had to say. The trick would be getting her safely to someone who could protect her. While she told her story, as dawn approached, Abram made himself a promise as binding as any oath spoken in church. Rebecca would not go back to Philadelphia, not to Richard Ashford, not to the warehouse meetings, not to a world where children were bought and sold like livestock. She'd found sanctuary on his farm, and sanctuary it would remain, no matter what forces gathered against them. The wooden chest at the foot of Abram's bed had remained unopened for 23 years, its contents buried beneath layers of regret and determination to never again use the skills the army had burned into his soul. But desperate times called for the resurrection of forgotten expertise, and protecting Rebecca required more than farming wisdom and Christian charity. The hinges protested with rusty squeaks as Abram lifted the heavy lid, releasing the musty smell of old wool and leather. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, lay the artifacts of another life, his military discharge papers, a few letters from Sarah during his brief deployment, and beneath it all, the things he'd hoped never to need again. Maps of local terrain that he'd sketched during long evenings when sleep wouldn't come. Detailed notes about defensible positions, escape routes, and the tactical advantages of fighting on familiar ground. The habits of a soldier died hard, even in a man who'd chosen peace over war, farming over fighting. But it wasn't the maps that made his hands tremble as he lifted them from their resting place. It was the medal wrapped in a faded ribbon, the bronze star he'd earned for actions in France that still visited his dreams on difficult nights. The citation spoke of courage under fire, of saving wounded comrades when retreat was the safer option. But Abram remembered it differently, remembered the necessity of violence, the terrible calculations that combat demanded, the way good men could do brutal things when the alternative was watching innocents die. 23 years, he murmured, holding the medal up to the lamplight. 23 years of trying to forget what I learned about fighting. Some knowledge, once gained, never truly left. As he spread the topographical maps across his bed, muscle memory guided his hands to mark firing positions, choke points, and the hidden paths through Miller's woods that only a lifetime of hunting had revealed. If Richard Ashford came for Rebecca, when he came, because men like that never simply gave up, Abram would be ready. A knock at the front door interrupted his tactical planning. Through the window he could see Jonas Yoder's familiar silhouette, the old farmer's shoulders hunched against the November wind. Jonas had been his father's friend, his own mentor in the ways of their community, and one of the few men whose judgment Abram trusted without reservation. "Jonas," Abram said, opening the door to find the elderly man's weathered face creased with worry. "We need to talk, Abram. There's been developments." They settled in the kitchen, where Rebecca had left evidence of her afternoon baking. Loaves of bread cooling on wooden racks, the sweet smell of cinnamon and nutmeg lingering in the air. Domestic peace that felt increasingly fragile with each passing day. "Men came to see me today," Jonas said without preamble. "City men, asking questions about a missing girl, showed me one of them posters, asked if I'd seen anything unusual in the district." Abram's blood cooled, despite the warmth of the kitchen stove. "What did you tell them?" "Told them I'd keep an eye out, same as I'd tell anyone looking for a lost child." Jonas leaned forward, his pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence. That age hadn't dimmed, but Abram, these weren't lawmen. Dressed too fine, spoke too careful, had the look of men who do their business in shadows. Private investigators, or worse. Jonas accepted the coffee Abram offered, wrapping his gnarled hands around the warm mug. They left money, $50, just for information about the girl's whereabouts. Said there'd be more for anyone who could lead them to her. $50 on top of the $500 reward. Enough money to tempt even honest people to reconsider what they'd seen, what they might have overlooked. Abram felt the net tightening around his small farm, around Rebecca's carefully constructed safety. Did they say how long they'd be in the area? Indefinitely. Took rooms at the boarding house in town. Said they were prepared to wait as long as necessary. Jonas studied Abram's face over the rim of his coffee mug. Son, I don't know what that child's running from, but men don't pay that kind of money for a simple family reunion. Abram made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. Jonas, what I'm about to tell you, it could put you in danger just for hearing it. I've lived 83 years on this earth, not much left that can scare me. So, Abram told him everything. Rebecca's true identity, Richard Ashford's criminal activities, the warehouse meeting that had turned a child into a witness whose testimony could destroy powerful men. Jonas listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. "Dear Lord in heaven," Jonas whispered when Abram finished, "that child, she's not just running from a bad home, she's running for her life. And now they've found her trail. It's only a matter of time before they connect her to this farm." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if seeking guidance in its dark depths. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decision. "My grandson, Peter, works for the railroad," he said slowly. "Good boy, steady, head on his shoulders. He could get word to federal marshals in Philadelphia, men who aren't on Richard Ashford's payroll. And until then, we make sure they don't get their hands on that child." Jonas met Abram's eyes with the steady gaze of a man who'd faced his share of hard choices. "I was in the war between the states, same as your father. Learned some things about fighting that don't leave a man just because he takes up farming." Abram felt something ease in his chest, the relief of not facing the coming storm alone. "There could be consequences for the whole community if we're discovered. Some consequences are worth bearing." Jonas stood up, his decision made. "I'll talk to the others. Not everyone, mind you, but the men I trust with my grandchildren's lives. We'll see who stands with us when the testing comes." Over the next 2 days, a quiet network of support took shape. Ruth Stoltzfus arrived with preserves, and the news that she'd convinced her husband to support Abram's cause, albeit reluctantly. Jacob Byler brought ammunition for Abram's old hunting rifle and information about strangers asking questions at the general store. Even young Samuel Zook, barely 18, but already showing the solid judgment that marked their best men, offered to serve as a messenger if communication became necessary. Not everyone joined their informal alliance. Bishop Eli maintained his position that civil authority should be respected, that proper channels existed for addressing such matters. Several families chose neutrality rather than risk involvement in what could become a dangerous situation. But enough stood with them to create a protective circle around Rebecca and Abram's farm. The girl herself seemed to sense the change in atmosphere without being told the specific details. She moved through her daily tasks with the careful attention of someone who understood that normalcy was a luxury that might be stripped away at any moment. But she also watched Abram with new eyes, seeing past the gentle farmer to the soldier, who'd awakened in response to threats against what he'd chosen to protect. "You're different," she observed one evening as they shared what might be their last peaceful meal for some time. "Different how?" "Harder, more watchful. Like you're seeing things the rest of us can't." She paused in her eating, studying his face. "Were you ever a soldier?" Abram considered lying, maintaining the illusion that violence was foreign to his nature. But Rebecca deserved truth, especially now when truth might be all that stood between her and the darkness that pursued her. "I was," he said simply. "A long time ago, in France." "Did you kill people?" The question hung in the air between them, stark and unavoidable. Abram met her eyes, seeing not judgment, but the practical curiosity of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required uncomfortable knowledge. "Yes." "Are you sorry?" "About some of it, not about all of it." He reached across the table and covered her small hand with his calloused one. Rebecca, there are times when good people have to do hard things to protect what matters most. This might be one of those times. She nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity of someone far older than her years. If they come for me, they won't take you. The promise came from the deepest part of him, the place where his love for his lost family had transformed into fierce determination to protect the family he'd found. I swear to you on Sarah's grave, on my children's memory, they will not take you. That night, as November wind rattled the farmhouse windows and carried the scent of coming snow, Abram made his final preparations. He cleaned his old service rifle, checked the hunting paths that led away from the farm, and positioned supplies at strategic points around his property. If Ashford's men came in force, if violence became unavoidable, he would be ready to do whatever was necessary to keep Rebecca safe. In her room upstairs, Rebecca lay awake listening to the sounds of preparation, understanding that the man who'd offered her work for food had become something far more precious, a father willing to fight for his daughter, whatever the cost. Around her neck, Sarah's wedding ring hung on its chain, a symbol of family that transcended blood, of love that chose its own definitions of belonging. The storm was coming. But for the first time in months of running, Rebecca wasn't facing it alone. They came with the morning mist, 3 black automobiles that looked as out of place on the country road as wolves in a sheep pasture. Abram spotted them from his kitchen window while Rebecca finished her breakfast. The vehicles moving slowly along the township road like predators testing the scent of prey. "Go upstairs," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching cars. "Get in the hiding place we prepared, and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Rebecca's spoon clattered against her bowl, but her voice remained steady. "How many?" 3 cars, maybe 9 or 10 men. Abram moved to the cabinet where he'd stored his rifle, checking the action with hands that remembered 20-year-old training. "More than we expected." She stood up from the table, and in that moment, she wasn't the frightened child who'd hidden in his barn. She was someone who'd survived months of running, who understood that survival sometimes required steel beneath. The softness. "Abram," she said, her voice carrying weight beyond her years. He turned to find her pulling Sarah's wedding ring from beneath her dress, the chain catching the morning light like captured starfire. "Take this," she said, lifting it over her head. In case something happens to me, I want you to have something that meant something to both of us." The trust in the gesture nearly broke his heart. She was giving him her most precious possession, the symbol of the family bond they'd built together, because she believed he would honor it even if she didn't survive what was coming. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said, but he accepted the chain and slipped it over his own neck. The ring settled against his chest, warm from her skin, carrying the weight of promise and protection. "I know," she said simply, "because you won't let it." The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the farmyard like gunshots. Abram moved to the front window and peered through the curtains, counting men in expensive suits who moved with the controlled precision of professionals. At their center walked a man who could only be Richard Ashford, tall, immaculately dressed, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from wealth and the power to bend others to his will. But it was the face that stopped Abram's blood cold. Even from a distance, he could see the calculated cruelty in Ashford's features, the expression of a man who viewed other people as property to be acquired or obstacles to be removed. This was the man who'd used his position to abuse a child, who'd built his fortune on the suffering of the innocent. A firm knock echoed through the house, polite, controlled, but carrying an undertone of threat that made Abram's military instincts flare to full alert. "Mr. Miller?" The voice from the porch was cultured, educated, designed to put simple farm folk at ease. "Mr. Abram Miller, I wonder if we might have a word." Abram checked his rifle one final time, then set it beside the door, where he could reach it quickly. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he opened the door to face the devil who'd come calling. Richard Ashford was younger than expected, perhaps 45, with silver-touched hair and the kind of manicured appearance that spoke of barber shops and tailors most farmers couldn't afford. His smile was warm, practiced, completely false. "Mr. Miller, I'm Richard Ashford. I believe you may have information about my stepdaughter, Rebecca." He gestured to the men flanking him, hard-faced professionals who didn't bother to hide their true nature behind polite smiles. "These are my associates. We're very concerned about Rebecca's welfare." "Don't know any Rebecca," Abram said evenly. "But I've seen the posters. Terrible thing when a child goes missing." "Indeed." Ashford's eyes were already moving past Abram, scanning the farmhouse interior with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to finding what he was looking for. "The thing is, Mr. Miller, we have reason to believe she may have passed through this area. A girl matching her description, perhaps going by a different name. Lot of travelers on the roads these days. Hard times make people move around more than they used to." "True enough." Ashford stepped closer, and Abram caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker, the smell of a man who'd grown comfortable with violence. "But this particular girl, she's family, you understand. We're prepared to be very generous to anyone who helps us bring her home safely." The word "safely" carried special emphasis, and Abram heard the threat beneath the courtesy. This wasn't negotiation. It was barely disguised intimidation wrapped in the language of civil discourse. "Mr. Ashford," Abram said carefully, "I'm a simple farmer. I tend my land, mind my own business, and help my neighbors when they need it. I don't involve myself in family matters that don't concern me." "Of course not. But sometimes family matters become everyone's concern." Ashford's smile grew sharper, more predatory. "Sometimes a missing child finds her way to a lonely farm, and a well-meaning person provides shelter without understanding the full situation." "And what situation would that be?" "Rebecca is a troubled girl, Mr. Miller, prone to telling stories, creating drama where none exists. Her mother's death affected her severely. Sometimes she makes accusations against people who've tried to help her, claims things happened that never did." Ashford's voice carried the practiced smoothness of a man who'd told this lie many times. "We just want to get her the help she needs." Abram felt rage build in his chest, like steam in a boiler. Here was a man who'd spent months crafting a narrative that painted his victim as delusional, who'd prepared excuses for every crime he'd committed. The sophistication of the lie spoke to how many times he'd used similar tactics, how many victims he'd discredited before they could find their voice. "Sounds like a difficult situation," Abram said neutrally. "It is, but one that can be resolved quickly with the right cooperation." Ashford reached into his coat and withdrew a thick envelope. "As I mentioned, we're prepared to be generous." The envelope hit the porch between them, like a gauntlet thrown down, thick with bills that represented more money than Abram had seen since before the Depression. But instead of reaching for it, he let his hand drift toward the shotgun propped beside his door, his father's old double-barrel, worn smooth by decades of use but still deadly at close range. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Ashford," Abram said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his muscles. "But I already told you, I don't know any Rebecca." Ashford's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Mr. Miller, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Perhaps I should be more direct." "Perhaps you should. My stepdaughter's on this property. My associates have been watching your farm for 2 days. We've seen her moving around inside the house, helping with household tasks." The pretense of politeness evaporated like morning mist. "We're not leaving without her. Your associates have been watching the wrong farm." Abram's hand closed around the shotgun stock. "And they're trespassing on my land." One of Ashford's men, a thick-set brute with scars on his knuckles, stepped forward. "Maybe we should just search the place, boss. Save everyone some time." "I don't think so," came a new voice from behind them. Abram felt relief wash over him as Jonas Yoder emerged from the barn, followed by Jacob Byler and young Samuel Zook. All three men carried hunting rifles with the easy familiarity of men who'd grown up using tools that could kill as easily as they could put food on the table. "Morning, Abram," Jonas said mildly, as if armed standoffs were as common as discussing weather. "Thought you might have visitors today. Brought along some friends who wanted to meet them." More figures appeared from strategic positions around the farmyard. Ruth Stoltzfus from behind the smokehouse, two of the Byler boys from the woods beyond the pasture, old Henrik Miller, no relation despite the name, from the cover of the equipment shed. Not an army, but enough firepower to make even professional killers think twice about their odds. Ashford's expression shifted from confident predator to wary calculator. "This is a private family matter. These people have no business interfering." "Funny thing about our community," Jonas said, his rifle held casually but ready. "We tend to take an interest in anyone who threatens our neighbors, especially when those neighbors are harboring children who need protection. The girl is my legal ward. I have every right." "You have the right to leave my property," Abram cut him off, peaceably and immediately. For a tense moment, the two sides faced each other across the farmyard, and Abram could feel the weight of impending violence pressing down like a summer thunderstorm. Ashford's men were professionals, but they were also outnumbered and outgunned by people defending their own territory. Then the sound of approaching horses broke the standoff. Sheriff Tom Bradley came riding up the lane with two deputies flanking him, their badges catching the morning sunlight. But more importantly, riding beside them was a man in a dark suit whose bearing spoke of federal authority. "Morning, folks," Sheriff Bradley said, dismounting with the deliberate movements of a man trying to defuse a dangerous situation. "Heard there might be some trouble out this way." The federal marshal stepped forward, his credentials already in hand. "Richard Ashford, I'm Marshal James Peterson, U.S. Treasury Department. You're under arrest for violation of federal trafficking laws." The color drained from Ashford's face like water from a broken dam. "I don't know what you're talking about." "This is a simple custody matter. We have a witness," Marshal Peterson said calmly. "A young lady who was present during certain business transactions in Philadelphia. Transactions involving the transport and sale of human beings across state lines." "Rebecca," Ashford breathed, his composure finally cracking. "That little, she doesn't know what she saw. She's just a child prone to making up stories. She's also under federal protection now," the marshal continued, "along with several other witnesses who've come forward since word of her testimony reached our office. Seems your warehouse operation wasn't as secure as you thought." Abram watched with grim satisfaction as handcuffs clicked around Ashford's wrists. The man who'd terrorized a child, who'd built his wealth on the suffering of the innocent, was finally facing consequences for his crimes. But Ashford wasn't finished. As the deputies moved to arrest his associates, he turned toward the farmhouse with desperate rage contorting his features. "Rebecca," he shouted, "you think this is over? You think hiding behind these farmers will protect you? There are others, men who won't be stopped by badges and country sheriffs. They'll find you, and when they do..." The threat was cut short by Jonas Yoder's rifle butt connecting with the back of Ashford's skull, dropping him unconscious to the porch steps. "Sorry," Jonas said mildly to the shocked federal marshal. "Sometimes my arthritis acts up, makes me clumsy with firearms." Marshal Peterson looked around at the assembled farmers, all of whom wore expressions of bland innocence, and decided that some accidents weren't worth investigating too closely. "Quite understandable," he said. "These things happen." As Ashford and his men were loaded into the sheriff's wagon under federal custody, Abram felt Sarah's wedding ring warm against his chest, a reminder of love that transcended loss, of family that chose itself despite the odds. The immediate danger was over. But as he watched the wagons disappear down the lane, Abram knew that true safety would come only when Rebecca could finally stop running and start living the life she deserved. Spring came early to Pennsylvania that year, as if the world itself was eager to wash away the shadows of the previous autumn. Abram stood on his front porch in the golden light of late April, watching Rebecca, who'd reclaimed her name along, with her freedom, tend the garden that had once been Sarah's pride and joy. The hand-carved wooden cross they'd made together during the long winter months stood at the garden's center, its simple lines catching the morning sun. It had taken them weeks to complete, working side by side at the kitchen table while snow covered the fields outside. Rebecca had insisted on carving the inscription herself, in memory of Sarah, Anna, Samuel, and Benjamin Miller, beloved family, who live forever in our hearts. Below that, in smaller letters, and in celebration of new beginnings. The legal proceedings had taken months to resolve, but Marshal Peterson had been true to his word about protection. Rebecca's testimony, combined with evidence seized from Ashford's warehouses, had exposed a trafficking network that stretched from Philadelphia to Boston. Ashford himself would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, along with most of his associates. More importantly for Rebecca's immediate future, the investigation had uncovered evidence of her stepfather's financial manipulation of her mother's estate. What had appeared to be debts and poverty had actually been carefully orchestrated theft, designed to make both Rebecca and her mother dependent on Ashford's false generosity. The recovered assets, along with her father's original inheritance that had been illegally seized, meant that Rebecca was not the penniless orphan she'd believed herself to be. But wealth meant nothing to a child who'd found something far more valuable, a home where she was wanted for herself, not for what she could provide to others. The adoption papers came through, Abram said, watching Rebecca coax new life from soil that had lain fallow too long. Judge Harrison signed them yesterday. You're officially a Miller now, if that's still what you want. She looked up from the seedlings she was transplanting, her face bright with joy that made the April sunshine seem pale by comparison. Rebecca Miller, she said, testing the sound of it. I like how that sounds. Your mother would be proud, he said, thinking of Sarah's own fierce protectiveness, her instinct for gathering lost souls and making them part of the family. Both mothers would be proud, Rebecca corrected gently. The one who gave me life and the one who gave me her name to carry forward. The integration into community life had come gradually, built on the foundation of trust earned during those dangerous October days. Bishop Eli, initially resistant to the irregular circumstances of Rebecca's arrival, had become one of her strongest supporters once the full truth emerged. The same community that had once questioned Abram's judgment now praised his courage and Christian charity. Sunday services had become a source of quiet joy rather than obligation. Rebecca sang hymns with the voice of someone who'd found peace after wandering in darkness, and her questions during Bible study showed a mind eager to grow in understanding. The other children, initially shy around the newcomer with such an exotic background, had gradually accepted her as one of their own. Ruth Stoltzfus had taken it upon herself to teach Rebecca the finer points of traditional cooking and household management. Every Miller woman should know how to make proper choufle pie, she'd declared, as if Rebecca's integration into Pennsylvania Dutch culture was a foregone conclusion rather than an ongoing process. The afternoons spent learning to churn butter, preserve vegetables, and manage the complex rhythms of farm life had given Rebecca something she'd never experienced. The confidence that came from useful skills, from knowing she could contribute meaningfully to her family's well-being. Abram, Rebecca said, wiping soil from her hands on her apron, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found your barn that night? He considered the question seriously, as he did all her inquiries about their shared past and uncertain future. I think about it sometimes. I think you would have found safety somewhere else. You're too strong, too clever to have been defeated by men like Ashford. But would you have found, she gestured around them, encompassing not just the farm but the renewed sense of purpose that filled every corner of their shared life. Would you have found your way back to living instead? Of just surviving? The question struck to the heart of his own transformation. The man who'd discovered her in his barn had been slowly dying of loneliness, going through the motions of life without any real engagement with its possibilities. The man standing on this porch was fully alive again, connected to his community, invested in the future in ways he'd thought lost forever. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'd like to think so, but I honestly don't know. You saved me as much as I saved you, child. Maybe more." That evening, they sat at the kitchen table sharing the kind of comfortable silence that comes only to families who've weathered storms together. Rebecca worked on her school lessons. She'd insisted on starting formal education despite being ahead of most children her age, while Abram repaired harness leather and planned the spring planting. The routine was peaceful, ordinary, and utterly precious to both of them. After months of uncertainty and danger, they'd earned the right to be bored by normalcy, to take for granted the simple rhythms of domestic life. "Will you tell me about Sarah tonight?" Rebecca asked, as she often did when the day's work was finished. "Which story would you like to hear? The one about how she convinced you to plant that apple orchard, even though everyone said the soil was too rocky." Abram smiled, settling back in his chair to share the familiar tale. Sarah's stubborn optimism, her faith that love and patience could make anything grow, even in the most unlikely places. It was a story about more than fruit trees. It was about the power of believing in possibilities that others couldn't see. He talked. Rebecca listened with the attention of someone collecting treasures, storing away these glimpses of the woman whose place she'd inherited, whose memory she honored by filling their home with laughter again. Outside, the Pennsylvania countryside settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, and two souls who'd found each other across the darkness discovered once again that family, true family, was built not from blood alone, but from choice, commitment, and the courage to love despite loss. The apple trees Sarah had insisted on planting were beginning to bloom, their white blossoms promising fruit that would feed generations not yet born. Some things, once planted, with love and tended with care, grew strong enough to outlast the seasons of sorrow and bear witness to the eternal possibility of new beginnings.